They gave us numbers the first week and confiscated the names on the third day. That was the order of it. Numbers first, so we would have something to answer to, and then the names taken, so we would have nothing left to answer for. I remember thinking, when the guard with the clipboard read out 774 and pointed at my chest, that this was a precise and considered cruelty. They had done it many times, they knew the sequence. My brother Mian was 775. We had arrived together, processed together, shaved together in the same cold room, under the same buzzing overhead light. He was younger by 4 years, and he had the kind of face that still believed things would sort themselves out. I was 31. I had stopped believing that around the time the Gui Dao checkpoint officers pulled us off the transit platform and explained, in the polite and liturgical phrasing, the sect for everything, that we had been selected for an educational opportunity at Camp Prosperity. Mian thought there had been a mistake. I knew there had not. Prosperity Camp sat on reclaimed flatland 40 kilometers east of what had once been a manufacturing district, in the geography of the continent that the Gui sect had renamed 3 times in 4 decades. As each administrative reshuffle required a new ideological landscape, camp itself looked, from the approach road, like a medium-security industrial facility from an earlier century. Chain link doubled over barbed wire, modular buildings in corrugated prefab, a central compound where the daily reflection sessions were held. We, Dao Mandarins, had developed reflection sessions as their signature administrative tool. Every morning, every inmate stood in the compound and recited the sect's 12 affirmations of collective flourishing. Every evening, every inmate stood again and recited the 12 contritions of personal error. The words had been carefully chosen by the sect's theological committee to be simultaneously religious and bureaucratic, so that each phrase felt like prayer and policy simultaneously, and was, in practice, neither. It was noise designed to crowd out thought. After 5 months of it, I understood the mechanism exactly, and it still worked on me. The guards were not cruel in the obvious ways. That was another considered decision. Overt brutality creates martyrs, and the sect had no use for martyrs. What the camp did instead was bore you into dissolution. The work assignments were tedious beyond description. Not hard labor in the cinematic sense, but shuffling paperwork that referenced other paperwork. Sorting materials that would be unsorted and sorted again by the next shift. Cleaning surfaces that would be immediately dirtied by the cleaning process itself. Food was nutritionally adequate. The bunks were cold but not freezing. The lights were never fully off. After 2 years, I had begun to understand why this was the cruelest design of all. Suffering you can rage against. Boredom simply erodes you. Mian adapted better than I did, in the way that people with less to hold on to can sometimes float when heavier things sink. He found small pleasures. A card game played with a deck missing 3 suits. A kind of slow-growing friendship with the man in the bunk above him, who had been a composer before the sect banned the form of music he wrote. I watched my brother make these accommodations and felt something between admiration and grief. He was surviving. I was not sure I was doing the same thing. It was in the 3rd year that I first noticed the woman they called 731. She was Korean, which made her conspicuous in a camp whose population was overwhelmingly drawn from the Gui Dao sect's mainland jurisdiction. The sect had jurisdiction over portions of the peninsula as well, the result of the territorial consolidations that had followed the collapse. But Korean prisoners at Prosperity were rare enough that 731 stood apart, simply the fact of her difference. She was perhaps 28, slight with the particular stillness of someone who had decided that stillness was the most defensible position available to her. She did not make friends. She did not make enemies. She occupied her assigned space in the compound during reflection sessions, moved her lips in the approximate shape of the affirmations and contritions, without producing audible sound, and otherwise conducted herself in a way that the camp administration had no procedure for addressing, because she was not violating any specific rule. She had simply gone somewhere else inside herself and left a correctly behaving body behind. I noticed her for the first time because of her hands. During the 2nd evening contrite session of a week in the 4th month of year 3, I looked across the compound and saw her balancing something in her assigned row, arms at her sides. eyes directed at the required 45-degree angle toward the ground, and she was folding her fingers one by one, very slowly, as if counting something only she could see. It was not a gesture of defiance. It was a gesture of private accounting. She was keeping track of something the camp had decided did not exist, and she was doing it in the only space the camp could not surveil, which was the interior of her own closed fist. I looked away before any guard could notice me looking. That was the beginning of it. Though I would not have called it anything at the time. I was not in a position to call things anything. I was 774, and that was the sum of what I was permitted to be. The camp's internal social structure was, like most closed systems under pressure, more complex than its administrators intended. The Gui Dao doctrine held that the collective was the only meaningful unit, and that individual social bonds were a form of bourgeois contamination, to be dissolved and reconstituted as loyalty to the sect's vision of the greater harmony. In practice, this meant that the camp was covered in small, furtive, intensely loyal networks of 2 and 3 people who trusted each other, precisely because the official framework offered nothing worth trusting. Had his bunkmate, the former composer whose name before the camp had been something I never learned. I had no one, which was my own doing. I had been unwilling to offer the kind of trust that small networks require, because offering trust meant admitting I was going to be here long enough to need it. The Gui Dao administration was not ignorant of these networks. They were not ignorant of anything that happened at a scale larger than private thought. The camp's informant system was the administration's real institutional achievement, not the reflection sessions, which the inmates had learned to perform without internal compliance within the first 6 months, and not the work assignments, which were too obviously meaningless to produce genuine buy-in, but the informant system, which was elegant in the way that exploiting a structural feature of human nature is always elegant. People talked. Even people who knew they shouldn't talk eventually talked, because silence is physiologically unsustainable in social animals kept in close proximity for years. And the administration knew this and had arranged a mechanism, anonymous report forms, deposited in the locked boxes outside each bunk block, reviewed by the administrative duty officer, and filed into a system that recorded patterns rather than individual incidents, that turned the camp's inevitable social networks into a surveillance infrastructure they had not consented to build. I had understood this in the abstract before I sat down near 731 for the first time. Understanding it in the abstract did not change what I did, which is why understanding a system and being immune to it are 2 different things, and why the camps lasted as long as they did, despite being filled with people who could explain exactly how they worked. What it meant in practice was that every exchange at the eastern wall happened inside the awareness that it might be reported. This awareness was not paranoia. It was accurate because some fraction of the people in every compound were, for reasons of their own, using the report forms. Not most, but some enough. Swellen and I never discussed anything at the eastern wall that would have constituted a reportable violation, which was not calculation on my part, but rather the natural result of have a very little to say. That was not simply the acknowledgement of each other's existence, which the camp's rules prohibited in spirit and permitted in letter. The administration's rules were detailed and specific, which meant they had seams, and the seam Juelan and I occupied. 2 inmates in a permitted location during a permitted time interval, not touching, not exchanging materials, not discussing anything that could be classified as dissident content, was, technically, not a violation of anything. It was merely a human being sitting near another human being and choosing not to look away. I watched 731 from a distance for several months before anything changed. She ate alone. She worked her assigned shift in the document processing section without speaking to her section mates beyond the minimum required exchanges. In the evenings, after the contrite session, she would sometimes sit against the eastern wall of the compound, where the prefab overhang created a strip of shade in summer and partial shelter from the wind in winter. She always had something in her hands there. Never anything prohibited, because she knew better than to carry prohibited items, but always something. A pebble, a fragment of wire, Once a strip of fabric that might have been torn from her bunk's edge binding. These things over and over in her hands, with the focused attention of someone solving a problem that had no solution. Which I eventually understood was exactly what she was doing. In the 5th month of the 3rd year, I sat down against the eastern wall approximately 3 meters from her. She did not look at me. I did not look at her. We sat in parallel silence for perhaps 20 minutes before the evening bell called us back to the bunk block. I did not know why I had done it. I did not have a plan. I was not operating from strategy. I was simply tired of being alone, and she was the only person in the camp whose particular variety of alone seemed like something I could sit near without making it worse. The next evening I did it again, and the next. On the 4th evening she glanced sideways at me for perhaps 2 seconds and then looked away. On the 6th evening she said, in Mandarin that had a Korean inflection she had clearly spent time trying to erase and not succeeded, "You're 774. Yes, I said. You were a printer, she said before. Journalist, I said. The sect found some distinction between the two. She considered this. I was a translator, she said. The sect found no distinction at all. We were quiet after that. The bell came. Sheen, we stood and walked back to our respective bunk blocks and did not look at each other in the compound, and did not speak again for another 4 days. Something had been established. I could not have told you what, precisely. In the camp's enforced vocabulary of the collective, and the harmony and the flourishing, there was no word for what we had made in those 6 evenings by the eastern wall. Because the camp's vocabulary had been designed specifically to eliminate the concept. The concept was 2 particular people, acknowledging each other's particular existence. The camp's great project was the elimination of particularity. We had, without discussing it or planning it, begun to resist. Her name was Juelon. She told me on a Wednesday in the 8th month of year 3, in the shade of the eastern overhang, in a voice low enough that the nearest camera could not have picked it up. She said it the way you say something you have been keeping safe for a long time and are now choosing to risk. Carefully, as if the word itself were fragile, and she was not sure whether the space between us was trustworthy enough to hold it. I told her mine. She repeated it once, quietly, getting the tone right, which takes a moment when the word is new. Then she went back to turning her pebble over in her hands, and I watched the compound's afternoon light change on the prefab wall. And we sat there for a while just being named. Mian found out about my evening ritual after 6 weeks of it, and came to find me one morning looking simultaneously worried and amused, which was a combination only he could manage. He said, "The guards are going to notice." I said I doubted it, because the guards were managing 300 inmates, and were themselves exhausted by the camp's bureaucratic requirements. He said, "She's Korean." I said yes. He looked at me for a long moment, and then nodded slowly. The way he nodded when he had decided to stop arguing about something, he knew he wasn't going to win. He asked if she was kind. I said I didn't know yet. He said that seemed like a reasonable thing to find out. Shulan had been at Prosperity for 4 years when I arrived. She had been taken in the Peninsula consolidation, which predated the mainland sweeps, by roughly 18 months. She had a small son, 7 years old by the time I came to know her, living in the camp's family residential block, which the Gui Dao administration maintained as a calculated mercy because it was less expensive to house children within the facility than to establish separate processing. The boy's name was something she had told him in private, and that she referred to in public, including to me, only as Little One. She was not going to give the camp's records his name. That was the line she had drawn. The family residential block was a separate building within the compound, staffed by a rotation of guards who were, on average, marginally less different than the general population guards, not out of any particular policy of kindness toward children, because the Gui Dao doctrine's theological component included a specific reverence for the young as vessels of future collective harmony, which had the practical effect of making the guards assigned to the family block slightly more self-conscious about their behavior in front of the children than they might otherwise have been. This was not protection. It was a specific, narrow category of reduced harm, which is the best available category in places like Camp Prosperity. Suilan saw her son for 2 hours each day, in the family block's common area, during the permitted family contact window. She used these hours with the deliberate economy of someone who has calculated exactly what 2 hours a day can and cannot accomplish. She did not waste them on grief, which would have been the easiest thing. She used them to teach him language, mathematics at the level she could manage with the materials available, stories told from memory, the specific and irreplaceable thing of a parent's sustained attention. She was building him, 2 hours at a time, against the camp's sustained project of reduction. I do not think she would have described it that way. I think she would have said she was simply spending time with her son. The intention was visible in how she moved through the permitted window. She was precise, and she was present, and she was giving him what the camp could not provide and could not prohibit, which was the certainty of being known by someone who loved him. I met little one twice before the gates opened. He had his mother's stillness and her habit of watching things carefully before deciding how to respond to them. He was not an unhappy child, which I found both reassuring and quietly devastating. Reassuring because he had survived his circumstances without being broken by them, and devastating because he had had to develop the skill of surviving his circumstances at an age when no such skill should be necessary. The gates opened on a Tuesday in early autumn of year 5. There was no announcement, no official notification, no liturgical procedure to mark the transition. The camp commandant disappeared sometime during the night, took a vehicle from the motor pool, we learned later, and drove north, presumably toward the territorial zones where the Gui Dao hierarchy still had administrative control, or had had it until the previous week, when the sect's central committee had experienced the kind of internal collapse that authoritarian structures experience when the generation that built them dies, and the generation that inherited them discovers that inherited power requires the same maintenance costs as earned power and is unwilling to pay them. The sect had not been overthrown. It had not been defeated militarily. It had simply stopped, the way a machine stops when the people responsible for maintaining it walk away. The doctrine, the liturgy, the 12 affirmations, and the 12 contritions, all of it continued to exist as text in the camp's documentation systems. There was simply no one left to enforce it. The guards realized this at approximately 7 in the morning, when the morning check-in to the regional administrative center produced no response. By 9, word had spread through the inmate population in that particular way that information moves through closed systems, not broadcast but transmitted, person to person, in the charged whisper of something that hasn't been confirmed yet, but that everyone already knows is true. By noon, the gate was open and no one had closed it. The hours between noon and when we finally walked out were not the triumphant hours of liberation that people who have not experienced this kind of collapse imagine. There was no celebration. There was, for the first several hours, a quality of collective suspended breath. 300 inmates for whom the absence of structure was not relief but a specific, physical disorientation, the kind you feel when a sound that has been continuous for so long, you have stopped hearing it suddenly stops. The quiet after the Gui Dao's machine went silent was not peaceful. It was vertiginous. Some people walked out immediately and did not look back. I watched them go from the compound's center. A man who had been 812 for 4 years, walking through the open gate with his jacket over his shoulder, and his eyes fixed on the road with the focused stride of someone who has been walking toward this moment so long in his head that the actual moment requires no recalibration. Others did not move. A woman, in the bunk block adjacent to mine, sat on the steps of the building for most of the afternoon, not because she was afraid to leave, but because she could not yet resolve the question of where leaving led. The camp had been a container. Outside the container was a geography she had not navigated in years, with no map and no indicated direction, and no 12 affirmations to structure the day's meaning. The freedom was real. The freedom was also, in that first afternoon, indistinguishable from abandonment. I understood both responses. I had in myself elements of both. I found Mian first. He was sitting on his bunk looking at the open bunk block door with an expression I recognized. He was waiting to find out what he was supposed to do, and there was no mechanism left to tell him. 5 years of the camp's structure had done what the camp had intended. It had made the absence of structure feel like a more acute problem than the structure itself. Mian was free. He did not know what freedom looked like without someone telling him where to stand during it. I told him to pack what he had, which was almost nothing, and to meet me at the family residential block in 1 hour. Shuelan already knew. When I got to the block, she was standing outside it with little one, at her side, a single bag over her shoulder. A bag she had clearly kept ready, which told me more about her than anything she had said in 2 years of Eastern Wall evenings. She had been waiting for this day since before she admitted to herself that it might come. She looked at me and said, "Where do we go?" I said I wasn't sure yet. She nodded once, which was her way of saying that was acceptable, and shifted the bag on her shoulder. There was another woman, Lanlan, who had come to know Mian over the last 18 months of our captivity. A woman in her mid-30s who had been weakened by a respiratory illness the camp's medical facility had treated inadequately, as the camp's medical facility treated everything. She was not well. Mian was not prepared to leave without her, and I was not prepared to argue with him about it, so we became 5. Shuelan, little one, Lanlan, Mian, and me. We walked through the open gate at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in autumn, and the guard post was empty, and the road ahead of us was a road, and the sky was the particular gray of a season changing. The industrial city was 40 kilometers west, and took us 2 days to reach on foot, because Lanlan could not move quickly, and because we did not know the roads well enough to take shortcuts. We slept the first night in a drainage channel, under a highway overpass that smelled of old concrete and the particular staleness of spaces humans had used and then abandoned. Little one slept against his mother's side without complaint, though the ground was cold. Mian kept watch in 2-hour increments that I shared with him, though there was nothing to watch for. The Gui Dao checkpoints along this road had been staffed by personnel, who had presumably received the same absence of morning check-in as our camp had, and drawn the same conclusions and left. The industrial city's name had been a manufacturing district name before the collapse, and had been renamed twice by the sect, and was now, in the absence of the sect, simply a geography. A long low sprawl of concrete and prefab, and the remnant infrastructure of production facilities that had gone dormant when the supply chains that fed them collapsed along with the civilization that had generated the demand. The city was not ruined in the spectacular sense of popular imagination. No dramatic broken skylines, no skeletal towers. It was ruined in the mundane sense. Slow disinvestment, gradual abandonment, the creeping recession of maintenance, until the things that needed maintaining simply stopped being maintained and became archaeology. The apartment blocks at the city's western edge had been residential housing for the factory district's workforce, and some of them remained structurally sound, and some of them had people in them. We were not the first former inmates to arrive, nor, I suspected, would we be the last. The city had a quality I had not expected, and could not immediately name, which was a kind of dignity. Not the dignity of achievement or intention. The buildings had not been built to be beautiful, and had not become beautiful through their abandonment. There was a dignity in the simple fact of their persistence. They had been built for a specific purpose, by specific people, who had specific lives in them, and the purpose had ended and the people had gone, and the lives were over, but the buildings were still standing, still doing the minimum work of being vertical and enclosing space. And this seemed, in those first days, like a form of testimony. The world had continued past the point where it was supposed to, so had we. We found a 4th-floor apartment in a building whose elevator had been non-functional for at least a decade, and whose stairwell was dark enough that we used Mian's emergency lighter to navigate the upper flights. The apartment had 3 rooms, a kitchen unit with a gas connection that still functioned at reduced pressure, and windows whose glass was intact on 2 of the 3 exposures. Previous occupants had taken most of what was movable and left what was not. A metal bed frame in the back room, a table bolted to the kitchen wall, a series of hooks by the front door that had once held coats. On the wall of the main room, someone, an occupant from before the collapse, or after it, there was no way to know, had painted in small, careful characters a line from a poem that the Gui Dao sect had banned for ideological impurity. I recognized the poem. I did not say so aloud. First night in the apartment, after Mayan and Lan Lan were settled, and little one was asleep, I sat in the kitchen with the gas ring, turned low for warmth, and looked at the window, which showed me the dark city and my own reflection. I had not seen my reflection clearly in 5 years. The camp's ablution facilities had mirrors that were polished metal rather than glass, which gave back a version of your face that was accurate enough for shaving purposes and deliberately imprecise for everything else. The kitchen window's glass was clear. The man looking back at me from it had aged in ways I could account for, and ways I could not, which is true of everyone who has spent 5 years in a place designed to make time move without consequence. He looked weathered. He looked, I thought, like someone who had been somewhere and come back from it. That was acceptable. That was something. We divided the space. Mian took the room with the bed frame, and Lan Lan lay on the frame under their combined jackets and slept for 14 hours. Shulan and Little One took the main room. I took the kitchen. In the days that followed, we developed the rhythms of survival in the way that humans do when survival is the primary available project. Systematically, without glamour, with the kind of focused attention that the camp's meaningless labor had never managed to produce in us, because the camp's labor had no consequence and this did. Water came from a standpipe 2 blocks over that remained pressurized from a municipal system that had not yet fully failed. Food came from a distribution point that had been established in the city's former transit hub by a coalition of former inmates and local residents, who had, with the practical urgency of people who had not eaten reliably in years, organized themselves faster than any ideology had ever managed to organize them. The distribution was rough, and the rations were not generous, but they were consistent, which was more than we had had any reason to expect. Lan Lan stabilized. Mian was attentive to her, in a way that I found both moving and characteristic. He had always been the brother who paid attention to the specific requirements of the person in front of him. And Lan Lan's requirements were specific: rest, warmth, the particular company of someone who would sit with her without demanding anything in return. He did all of this without being asked, and without making it seem like a sacrifice, which was a quality I had always admired in him and never fully understood. Little One explored the building with the methodical curiosity of a child who has learned that new spaces contain both threats and resources, and should be assessed for both, before committing to either. He found, on the 2nd floor, a room that had once been a children's common space for the building's residential families. The hooks for small coats were still there, and a stack of laminated educational materials that the Gui Dao administration had distributed for approved home study, and in a cabinet in the corner, behind the laminated materials, a set of wooden blocks that predated the sect entirely. He brought the blocks upstairs with the expression of someone who has discovered something of great value and is not sure whether it is permitted to keep it, and I told him to keep it. And he sat in the main room for an entire afternoon building structures, and knocking them down and building them again with the focused private pleasure of a child who has not had unstructured time in years, and is relearning what to do with it. Shh. Zualanson watched him from the kitchen doorway that afternoon and said nothing. She had, since the gates opened, been in a particular state that I did not immediately know how to name. It was not grief, and it was not joy, and it was not relief, though it contained elements of all three. The camp had taken 5 years from her, and now the camp was gone, and what remained was the specific problem of the present tense. She existed, in this room, in this building, in this city, with these people. And the Gui Dao's answer to that, the 12 affirmations, the collective purpose, the assigned role, was gone, and she did not yet have her own answer, and the gap between those two things was, I thought, the real danger. Not the cold, not the food scarcity, not the uncertain infrastructure of the former city. The danger was the gap. I had watched this happen to other people in the first weeks after the sect's collapse. People who had been prisoners, or true believers, or both. The categories were not as distinct as outsiders imagined, and who had organized their entire inner life around the sect's structure, not because they agreed with it, but because structure is what an inner life requires, and the camp had provided structure even when it provided nothing else. Without the structure, some people sat down and did not get up again, not from physical failure. The failure of the question that had kept them moving inside the structure. What do I do next? Encountering its own answer, in the post-sect world, which was anything, which was to say, nothing specific, which was to say, the question had no answer, which was to say, the question was not the right question. Swillen had been sitting with this for 9 days when I came into the main room one evening and found her standing at the window with her arms crossed and her reflection visible in the dark glass and an expression that I recognized from the compound's eastern wall, from the evenings before I sat down near her, and 3 meters, and silence became, over time, something else. She was counting again. She was counting what was left. I said her name. She did not turn immediately. She kept looking at the glass for a moment, at her own reflection in it, and then she turned and looked at me. And I saw in her face the thing I had first noticed in her hands in the compound. The private accounting, the keeping of records in the only space the system couldn't audit. She was keeping track of herself. She was making sure she was still there. I said, "Sit down." She sat. I sat across from her at the bolted table, which had become our table in the way that spaces become assigned in any shared dwelling, gradually and without discussion. I had nothing in particular to say. I did not have words that were adequate to the 5 years she had spent in that camp before I arrived. To the 4 years before those 5 years of whatever the Peninsula consolidation had taken from her. To the specific quality of loss that comes from having your name replaced with a number and your son's name replaced with a pronoun. I was a journalist before the camp, and I had, in the camp, understood the final meaning of my trade, which was that words are what we use to establish that experience has occurred, that a thing happened to a specific person in a specific place and time, and that it mattered. And the camp's great project had been the erasure of that establishment. It had insisted, with the full administrative weight of the Gui Dao sect behind it, that nothing in the camp happened to anyone. Because there was no anyone. Because the collective was the only unit. Because 731 was a number, and numbers did not have experiences. They had processing records. So, I did not reach for words that would be inadequate. I reached across the bolted table and put my hand over hers, the hand that was still turning an invisible something between her fingers. And I held it still, and I said her name again. She looked at my hand on hers. Then she looked at me. Then she made the specific sound that is not quite crying, and not quite not crying. The sound of a person who has been holding something at a controlled distance for so long that the effort of holding it has become invisible to them. And the sudden proximity of someone who is not asking them to keep holding it produces a kind of structural release that is not collapse, exactly, but the absence of the tension required to prevent it. She made that sound once. Then she breathed slowly and did not make it again. We sat like that for a while. Little one was asleep in the corner of the room, on a folded bedroll Mians had found in the building's storage basement. The gas ring in the kitchen put out a thin blue light. Somewhere in the building's lower floors, water was moving through old pipes, talking to itself the way water does in old buildings. Not the sound of failure, just the sound of a system that was still, despite everything, doing the work it was designed to do. In the weeks that followed, we rebuilt the shape of an ordinary life with the materials that were available to us, which were not many, but were more than nothing. Distribution hub at the transit center evolved. The initial rough-and-ready system was formalized by a coalition of former inmates, local residents, and a small number of administrators from the pre-sect municipal government who had survived the decades of the sect's administration by performing their functions with enough competence to be useful and enough invisibility to be unthreatening, and who now emerged, blinking, into the post-sect light, with the institutional knowledge of how water systems and power grids and food logistics worked, turned out to be the most valuable knowledge available, and was in shorter supply than any ideology. Mian found work with the Distribution Coalition's logistics arm. He had a facility for the organizational detail of moving things from place to place, for tracking what was where and what was needed where it wasn't. That had been entirely wasted in the camp and was now being fully used. Lanlon improved slowly, and then more quickly, and found in the building's second-floor former community room a use for the laminated educational materials she had initially regarded with the appropriate skepticism of anyone who had seen Gui Dao educational materials at close range. She separated out what was salvageable from what was propaganda and began in the afternoons to run an informal educational session for the children in the building. Little one was among her students. He was serious and attentive, and, according to Lanlon, already reading at a level that significantly exceeded his age, which Juelon received with the expression of a mother who is proud and does not know whether pride is yet permitted. I found work at the Transit Hub's information desk, which was not a desk in any formal sense but was a space near the entrance where people came to ask questions they could not answer themselves, and where I stood and answered what I could and directed the rest toward people who could answer it better. The work was modest. It was also the first work I had done in 5 years that had immediate and observable consequences. Someone came in not knowing where to find medical supplies, and left knowing, and the knowing was a direct result of my having been present and attentive, and this simple chain of cause and effect, available to every person in any functioning society but denied, for 5 years, by the camp's deliberate severing of consequence from action, struck me as almost unbearably significant. I told Xuelan about this one evening. She was sitting at the bolted table with a translation task she had taken on for the coalition. Documents from the pre-sect municipal archive that needed to be rendered from an older administrative language into the current one. A project that was both genuinely useful and a way of giving her Korean language skills a purpose in a context where they were valued rather than suspect. She listened to me describe the information desk, the chain of cause and effect, the feeling of the immediate consequence, and she said, "The camp was designed to break exactly that, the connection between doing and mattering." "Yes," I said. "And they almost managed it." "Yes," I said. She looked at her translation work for a moment. Then she said, "I thought, the first weeks here, I thought I didn't know how to matter anymore, that they'd taken that out of me, the machinery of it." I waited. "But it's not a machinery," she said. "It's simpler than that. It's just," she looked up, "someone knowing your name and what you do with the day. And whether you slept," she was right. The Gui Dao sect, in all its theological and administrative sophistication, in all the decades of its consolidation of power over the largest geographic unit in human history, had missed the point of what it was trying to destroy. It had been trying to destroy the collective, the abstract unit, the ideological formation. It had been trying to impose its own collective in place of the existing one. It had, in doing so, missed the actual structure it should have been afraid of, because the actual structure was not political and not ideological and not susceptible to administrative dissolution. It was two people at a surveil who knew each other's names and asked about each other's days. It was my brother Mian, watching Lon Lon sleep and adjusting the jacket over her shoulder without waking her. It was a small boy sitting in a second-floor room learning to read words that were not Gui Dao words, taught by a woman who was not his mother, but who saw him as a person rather than a case number. It was, in the end, what the camp spent 5 years trying to take from all of us, and what none of us had managed to fully give up, because it was not a thing that could be taken without also taking the person. And the camp had been too careful about taking people, too careful about the martyrs it didn't want to make, to go that far. The rumor about Port Perspective started circulating in the city about 2 months after our arrival. The name was already in circulation before the sect's collapse, spoken in the camp, in the way that all forbidden things were spoken, in the abbreviated shorthand of something whose full articulation is too dangerous for open air. Perspective was said to be a settlement in the coastal zone, administered by the Pan-Asian Coalition, that had maintained de facto independence from the Gui Dao sect by virtue of its geographic position and its commercial relationships with the maritime networks that the sect had been unable to fully control. It was said to be organized around principles of open settlement. Anyone who arrived and was willing to work was welcome, and no one's history with the sect was held against them. It was said to have schools. It was said to have a port that still functioned, which meant it had trade, which meant it had things that didn't exist in the former industrial city. Things like medicine, and materials, and the specific kind of hope that comes from knowing your work connects you to something larger than the immediate day. Ian wanted to go. He brought it up first, carefully, watching my face for the response. He said Lanlan would be better there, better medical access, better air quality than the industrial district, which still carried the particulate legacy of its manufacturing years. He said it, the way he said things when he had already decided, but wanted me to arrive at the decision myself. Talked to Shuelan about it that night. She had already heard the rumors. The translation work had given her access to more of the city's information flows than most people had, and she had been thinking about it in her careful, prior to decision way. She said, "It's a rumor, we don't know what it is." "No," I agreed. "We know what this is," she said, meaning the city, the apartment, the distribution hub, the bolted table. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Little one should have something that isn't this." Not because this was unbearable, she meant. This was, by the measure of the last 5 years, remarkable. It was ruins, and the child deserved something that wasn't ruins. We left in early winter, the 5 of us again, with better supplies than we'd had in autumn. The coalition's logistics work had improved distribution, and Mian's contribution to it had earned us a reasonable allocation of travel supplies. The road was cold but passable. Lanlan was stronger and moved without difficulty. We walked the first 3 days on roads that had once been regional highway, and were now something between road and trail, the asphalt intact in places and elsewhere, broken by the freeze-thaw cycles of years, without repair into a surface that required attention. I thought often, on those 3 days, about the road east, from the camp that we had walked in the other direction 4 months earlier. The same category of landscape, the same post-sect geography, but experienced differently now, because we were going towards something with a name, rather than away from something we were glad to leave. Direction is a significant variable in how a road feels under your boots. Little one walked the whole distance himself, which was a matter of some negotiation. On the first day, when he arrived at his limits around mid-afternoon, and was offered a carry that he declined on grounds of dignity that were entirely legible to me, he walked more slowly after that, and Juan adjusted her pace to his, without making a production of it, and the 5 of us moved as a group with the unhurried solidarity of people who have no reason to separate. On the 4th day, we caught a ride on a freight carrier, operated by a man who had been transporting goods along this route before the collapse, and had simply continued to do so, through the Gui Dao decades, by the method of being too commercially useful to arrest, and too politically boring to bother. He spoke very little and drove, with the focused competence of someone who has been doing a thing for so long that it has become a form of meditation. Little one sat in the cab between his mother and the driver, and watched the road ahead with the same systematic attention he had given the building's floors, cataloging what was there, noting what was absent, processing. The driver dropped us 20 kilometers from the coast, at a junction that had once had a fuel station, the infrastructure of which remained as a navigational landmark, even though the function was long gone. We walked the last 20 kilometers over 2 days. The landscape changed as we approached the coast, the flat industrial geography giving way to terrain that had never been built on, and then cleared, and then left to re-establish itself in whatever form the land wanted to take, without human supervision. There were grasses. There were, in the sheltered cuts between low hills, the beginnings of scrub forest. The air tasted different. Someone noticed it first and said nothing, just breathed more slowly, which was how he indicated things that mattered. We saw the coast before we saw the settlement, the quality of the light changing, the particular weight of salt in the air, the way the horizon opened up when you crested the last inland ridge and the sea appeared. I had not seen the sea in 7 years. I had forgotten what it looked like. Not the image of it which I retained, but the experience of its scale, the way it establishes the actual size of things by providing an unbroken reference. The world was large. That was what the sea said. The world was large, and most of it was not the camp. Sualan stood at the ridge and looked at the water for a long moment without speaking. Little one stood beside her. He had not seen the sea before in any form he could remember. He was 12 now, and the years he might have had the opportunity to see it been spent in Camp Prosperity's family residential block, he looked at it with the expression he brought to everything genuinely new. Systematic, assessing, and then, when the assessment resolved into something he recognized as significant, quietly moved. He said something to his mother in Korean, "Lo, not for us." She put her hand on his shoulder. Shh. They stood there together for a minute, looking at the water, and the rest of us waited without impatience. Because this was not a moment that required managing. Perspective was smaller than the rumor, and more functional than I had allowed myself to hope. It was a working port settlement, 2,000 people, or more already, organized with the practical urgency of a community that had been making do without external support for long enough to have developed real institutional competence. The Pan-Asian Coalition administration was thin. Not much more than a coordination layer over a community that had already organized itself at the local level, but it was present, and it was not the Gui Dao, and that distinction was sufficient for the moment. There were already former inmates there. Dozens of them, from camps in different jurisdictions, different sect-administered territories. They had arrived the way we had arrived, walking, catching rides, following rumors toward the coast. The settlement had developed, organically, a practice for receiving them. Someone met you when you arrived, showed you where the water was and where you could sleep, and what the current work assignments were. Did not ask about the camp unless you raised it yourself. Gave you, in other words, the same thing I had tried to give Juelon in the compound's eastern shadow, and at the bolted table and across every evening of the 3 years that had made us whatever we were. The assumption that you were a person, specific and particular, with a name and a history and something to offer the day. I found work at the settlement's communications post. They needed people who could write, and there were not many, because the sect had made writing a specifically controlled activity for the obvious reasons that controlling writing was the prerequisite for controlling the account of events. Wrote for the settlement's information bulletins. What was available, what was needed, what was known, and what was not yet known. Plain language, direct sentences. Nothing that wasn't true. Because the available supply of things that weren't true had been, for the moment, more than fully exhausted. The work was slower than it looked from the outside. Every sentence I wrote, I reread for the kind of administrative slippage that the Gui Dao's language had been built from. The passive construction that removed agency. The collective noun that dissolved the individual. The aspirational verb that promised something the compound noun behind it couldn't deliver. The camp had run on language like that. I was not going to produce language like that, even in a bulletin about water distribution schedules. The water was available at the northern standpipe between 6 and 10 in the morning. That was the sentence. Not the water resources of the collective were allocated to facilitate communal access during the designated harmonization period. The water was at the standpipe. Go before 10. It sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. Language that tells you what is true and where to find it, without asking you to feel a particular way about it, or to affirm a particular doctrine in exchange for receiving it. That kind of language had been contraband for decades in the Gui Dao's territory. Writing it felt like performing a technical function I had been trained for, and then forbidden from exercising. It felt like being a journalist again, not the romantic version of the trade, the version that imagines itself as heroic. The actual version, which is mostly just the careful and unglamorous project of writing down what happened accurately, so that someone who wasn't there knows what was true. Mian and Lan found a room in the eastern residential section. Lan began recovering with a speed that suggested the industrial city's air quality had indeed been a significant factor in her illness. Within 2 months, she was well enough to resume the teaching work she had begun there. And this time in a formal structure, an actual school, organized by the settlement's education committee, with materials from the coastal trading networks. Little one attended the school and thrived in it in the uncomplicated way of children whose intelligence has been adequately housed. He made a friend, the first real friend I had observed him making, a boy roughly his age whose family had been in the settlement for almost a year and who had apparently established himself as the building's resident expert on which tide pools contained a subject on which little one had the same response as to the wooden blocks and the second-floor educational materials. Focused, systematic, genuine curiosity. They spent their afternoons at the tide pools. Watched them from the shore, with an expression I did not try to interpret, because some things are not available to interpretation and were not meant to be. They were meant to be witnessed, and witnessing was sufficient. One evening in early spring, when the light lasted long enough that we could sit outside after dinner, and the air was still cold, but without the edge that had made the winter's air feel like the air of a place that did not want you. Joelan told me her son's name, Pulsin. The name she had kept out of the camp's records, and out of the air, anywhere that the camp's surveillance might have been listening. She said it quietly. In Korean first, then in Mandarin, as if translating something precious, and wanting to make sure it was available in all the languages of the people who needed to know it. I repeated it back to her correctly, in languages. She listened to me, say it and nodded once. Slowly, the way she had nodded when I told her I didn't know yet where we were going, and she had determined that was acceptable. She looked out at the water, where the last light of the day was doing what light does on water, making ordinary physics look like a decision, like someone had chosen specifically to illuminate exactly this. And she said, "They had 5 years with me and they never once remembered my name without looking at a clipboard." "No," I said. "You remembered it from the first week." I had. I don't know why I had. I am not by temperament the kind of man who has explanations for everything he does. I had sat down by the eastern wall because I was tired of being alone, and I had listened when she said her name. And the name had stayed, and the staying had not required any conscious effort, because it is not difficult to remember the name of a person you see. It is only difficult, if you have trained yourself, at great institutional expense, not to see them. That was what I said, approximately. I said it in the plain way that I had learned was the only way worth saying things. No flourishes, no framing, no borrowed authority. Just the thing. She was quiet for a moment. The light continued to do what it was doing. The water continued. Then she said, "I know," and that was enough. Everything. The camp, the erased names, the 5 years, the 40 kilometers of road, the ruined city, the winter, the coast. That was what was left when you stripped everything else away. One person saying "I know" to another, meaning, "I see you, I see that you see me, and we are whatever else we are, not numbers, and we are not alone, and the world is large and we are still in it." I have written this account at the settlement's communications post over the course of several weeks, in the plain style and direct sentences that are the only style I trust. I have not dramatized it. I have not made it larger than it was, because it does not need to be larger. The Gui Dao sect, at the height of its administrative power, controlled more territory than any political entity in the previous century. It commanded the labor and the daily liturgy of hundreds of millions of people. It had doctrines and committees and camps and checkpoints. And the full weight of a theology that had convinced itself it was also an administration, and an administration that had convinced itself it was also a theology. And in the end, all of it, the entire apparatus of the erasure of persons, was not sufficient to make a woman forget her own name, was not sufficient to stop a man from sitting down 3 meters away from her and staying there, was not sufficient to prevent a child from carrying wooden blocks up 4 flights of stairs and spending an afternoon building things that had no purpose except the pleasure of building them. Do not offer this as evidence of anything vast. I offer it as evidence of exactly what it is. The specific and ordinary and apparently indestructible human habit of knowing who is next to you and caring what they are called. Gui Dao sect designed a machine to eliminate that habit, and ran it for decades, and spent resources that would have fed populations and built cities and generated anything you might think of as real prosperity. And it did not work, because the habit is not a political formation, or an ideological commitment, or anything that a political formation or ideological commitment can reach. It is smaller than that and harder. It is knowing someone's name and saying it out loud in a place designed to make you forget it. We are still here. That is the end of the account. Still here. And we know each other's names, and the spring is coming in off the water, and the boy is at the tide pools. And that is what remained when everything the sect built came apart. That, and nothing less and nothing more.